But let me first of all say congratulations indeed to all of the organizations that have sponsored this fourth conference. It is indeed an important initiative that we get together to reflect on these challenges about what is it that we need to do as Africans to solve our problems. But congratulations indeed, and thanks to everybody for coming. Now, Bayo Olukoshi says that we must be the drivers of our own future. And I'm sure all of us agree. I'm sure all of us agree about that. But I'd hoped that the chairperson would give him an extra 15 minutes to explain how we become those drivers. Because that's an important part of this question. I have been wandering around the continent a bit in the last few weeks. Went to Cape Verde and Senegal and Nigeria and Khartoum and Rwanda and I feel very unhappy. One of the countries that I've mentioned when we passed through, I learned a terrible story. The son of a former president, has been arrested and is going to be charged. Is going to appear in court. The trial starts next month in June, and that's not what made me unhappy. What made me unhappy was the reason. And the reason, the charge, as I was told, the charge is of embezzling public funds to the tune of €500 million. 500 million euro. I don't know how many trillions that is in rands. And I was asking, how does that happen? Desperately poor African country, needing all of these resources, every single cent of those resources to make an impact in terms of changing the quality of life of the people. But the son of the president steals at least €500 million. How does that happen? Now, Bayo should answer that question. When he says we must be these drivers, it's a large sum of money. But I'm quite certain that there are smaller sums of money that are stolen elsewhere on our continent. This disease is not particular to this one particular country I'm talking about, African, but it's across the continent. We've got to answer the question, how do we stop it? To denounce it, to do all sorts of things, to throw stones at this thing, of course, but how do we stop it? This is a particular challenge. And these answers are not easy to find. We arrived here from last night from Rwanda after attending the annual meeting of the African Development Bank. There's a very sharp question that arose during the discussions there, which is a question that you just mentioned, a question of leadership. And everybody was saying, clearly there is something that's gone wrong with regard to the quality of leadership on our continent. The last session we attended before we came back, we had a title like the leadership we need. What was it, Mujanku? Leadership for the Africa we need or want. Leadership for the Africa we want. So the panel discussed this. Before that, there had been another session which was discussing matter about ending conflict on the continent. So when we're discussing that matter about ending conflict on the continent, the question arose, how do these conflicts start? Why? Why do they start in the first place before you come to ending them? And I was saying that if you take, for instance, this terrible, terrible war that's going on in South Sudan. Now, that war was eminently avoidable. It's unnecessary. But you see the destruction that has been caused and the great damage done to South Sudanese society for many years to come. And the reason for that war was really the failure of leadership. There's no other reason. It's a failure of leadership. And then, as I was saying later, when we're talking about this matter about the leadership that Africa needs, or the leadership for the Africa that we need, question arose as to, well, how do you produce these leaders? We need them. But where do they come from? Is there a bakery or something? And it's a difficult question to answer. During that interaction, the second one of the points that was made was that perhaps one of the things that needs to happen is that there must be some process by which the African leaders criticize themselves. A self-critical process. And in that context, of course, the African peer review mechanism was mentioned. Such that, for instance, why don't these African peers say to Thabo Mbeki, now you were president of South Africa for whatever period, and these are the wrong things you did. Why don't we do that? Now, there were a number of us in the room, serving presidents and former presidents. And all of us were afraid to take up this matter. Because, you sit there and you imagine that, if I had to get President so-and-so to sit here and say, President, I know you stole $100 million. Would I have the courage to say that? Or other things. But I'm trying to raise the question of who shall provide the answers to these questions as to what do we do? Patricia was talking about the need to re-energize civil society. And Bayo says a politicized civil society. I agree. But how are we going to do it? The British have, I found this expression when I was there many years ago, a quango. A quango. So what is a quango? No, it's a quasi-non-governmental organization. Now, when you have a Kwango, the funder, who is the government in this case, will determine what you have to say. You might call yourself a non-governmental organization, quasi, but that quasi means the government will tell you what to do. Just before the 2004 general elections here, the EU voted money to support the NGOs in connection with the elections. And they actually gave them a detailed brief. These South African NGOs, but funded from Brussels. They said, with regard to the elections, do this, do that, do the other. Fortunately, a number of those NGOs rebelled against this and said to the EU, therefore, keep your money. I mean, why NGOs here at home? These bodies we call NGOs. How many of them are domestically funded? Part of the reason here that post-1994, the NGO sector got weakened was because during the apartheid years, that NGO sector was foreign funded. And once you had a democratic South Africa and a democratically elected government and so on, of course the governments of Sweden and Norway and so on will say, well, now there's a democratically elected government, that's where our money goes. So the monies dry up and NGOs collapse. I've got one of my colleagues here sitting here in front. If we had time, I'd ask him to tell you a story of the Zimbabwe NGOs, who at a certain point actually said, look, if we don't sustain this sense of crisis about Zimbabwe, our funds are going to dry up. Yeah. Patricia is correct. We need this supported by this politicized civil society, but how is it going to be created? As I was saying, what about this leadership? We all recognize that there is a challenge here, but where is it going to come from? Now, that's part of the reason I was saying I was very glad indeed that we have this occasion of this conference, the fourth one, because it brings together a lot of brains to answer these questions. What is it that we need to do to produce the kind of leadership that we need to address the challenges that face us? I think it's one of the tasks of our intelligentsia to answer that question. I don't believe it's going to come from these leaders who are sitting in office, including us who are out of office. I think the answer to that question must come from somewhere else. And I think it can only come from an intelligentsia that sits there and looks very critically at what has happened. Ask certain questions like, once we had a very strong and vibrant All-African Students' Union. Many affiliates, national unions of students across the continent. It's collapsed. That signifies the demobilization of your African university student community, certainly in terms of its continental intervention. They might be active in each of their individual countries. I'm not sure how active, but certainly this body of African university students who were able to make their own intervention in terms of responding to these challenges, even challenging structural adjustment, That body has collapsed. The Pan-African Youth Movement, similar body, where is it? The Pan-African Women's Organization. Why have these organizations all disappeared? The African the Trade Union Unity, that Organization of African Trade Union Unity, which bringing together the trade union organizations on our continent. I don't see it, I don't hear of it anymore. Why? Even bodies like the All African Conference of Churches, very active, very militantly involved in the struggle for the liberation of the continent. It's still there, but its voice is not heard. What is it that has happened which has led to this layer of continental progressive organizations to disappear? There must be a reason. I'm saying that I think it's part of the task of our intelligentsia to look at this question, to seek answers to it, because in the end, we've got, when Patricia talking about civil society, we've got to reactivate our trade unions. Both at home and on the continent, we've got to reactivate our student youth and our women's organizations and so on. How? Maybe the first starting point might be to discover why is it that they collapsed. The political leaders in principle come from political parties, in principle.